Hey, squirrels. It didn't dawn on me till today that I didn't read yesterday, I don't think. Oh no, my book just went away. That was right there on the right chapter 17 of The Murder at the Vicarage. And it's supposed to be a Miss Marple book, but Miss Marple don't show up much. Very little. I love the old movies. There's a handful, 5 or so movies with Miss Marple. Okay, it's back. So, 17. Inspector Slack came round to see me the following morning. He is, I think, thawing towards me. In time, he may forget the incident of the clock. Well, sir, he greeted me. I've traced that telephone call that you received. Indeed, I said eagerly. It's rather odd. It was put through from the North Lodge of Old Hall. Now that lodge is empty. The lodge keepers have been pensioned off and new lodge keepers aren't in yet. The place was empty and convenient. A window at the back was open. No fingerprints on the instrument itself. It had been wiped clear. That's suggestive. How do you mean? I mean that it shows that call was put through deliberately to get you out of the way. Therefore, the murder was carefully planned in advance. If it had been just a harmless practical joke, the fingerprints wouldn't have been wiped off so carefully. No, I see that. It also shows that the murderer was well acquainted with Old Hall and its surroundings. It wasn't Mrs. Prothero who put that call through. I've accounted for every moment of her time that afternoon. There are half a dozen other servants who can swear that she was at home till 5:30. Then the car came round and drove Colonel Prothero and her to the village. The colonel went to see Quentin the vet about one of the horses. Mrs. Prothero did some ordering at the grocer's and at the fish shop, and from there came straight down the back lane where Miss Marple saw her. All the shops agree she carried no handbag with her. The old lady was right. She usually is, I said mildly. And Miss Prothero was over at Much Benham at 5:30. Quite so, I said. My nephew was there too. That disposes of her. The maid seems all right, a bit hysterical and upset, but what can you expect? Of course, I've got my eye on the butler, what with giving notice and all, but I don't think he knows anything about it. Your inquiries seem to have had a rather negative effect, Inspector. They do, and they do not, sir. There's one very queer thing has turned up, quite unexpectedly, I may say. Yes? You remember the fuss that Mrs. Price Ridley, who lives next door to you, was kicking up yesterday morning about being rung up on the telephone? Yes, I said. Well, we traced the call just to calm her, and where on earth do you think it was put through from? A call office? I hazarded. No, Mr. Clement, that call was put through from Mr. Lawrence Redding's cottage. What? I exclaimed, surprised. Yes, a bit odd, isn't it? Mr. Redding had nothing to do with it. At that time, 6:30, he was on his way to the Blue Boar with Dr. Stone in full view of the village, but there it is. Suggestive, eh? Someone walked into that empty cottage and used the telephone. Who was it? That's 2 queer telephone calls in one day. Makes you think there's some connection between them. I'll eat my hat if they... I'll eat my hat if they weren't both put through by the same person. But with what object? Well, that's what we've got to find out. There seems no particular point in the second one, but there must be a point somewhere. And you see the significance? Redding's house used to telephone from Mr. Redding's house used to telephone from Mr. Redding's pistol. That don't make sense. All throwing suspicion on Mr. Redding. Actually, it's got a period after from, and then something's left out there. It would be more to the point to have put through the first call from his house, I objected. Ah, but I've been thinking that out. What did Mr. Redding do most afternoons? He went up to the old hall and painted Miss Prothero, and from his cottage he'd go on his motor bicycle, passing through the north gate. Now you see the point of the call being put through from there. The murderer is someone who didn't know about the quarrel and that Mr. Redding wasn't going up to Old Hall anymore. I reflected a moment to let the inspector's points sink into my brain. They seemed to me logical and unavoidable. Were there any fingerprints on the receiver in Mr. Redding's cottage, I asked. There were not, said the inspector bitterly. That dratted old woman who goes and does for him had been and dusted them off yesterday morning. He reflected wrathfully for a few minutes. She's a stupid old fool anyway. Can't remember when she saw the pistol last. It might have been there on the morning of the crime, or it might not. She couldn't say. She's sure they're all alike. Just as a matter of form, I went round and saw Dr. Stone. He went on. I must say he was as pleasant as could be about it. He and Miss Cram went up to that mound or barrow, or whatever you call it, about 2:30 yesterday and stayed there all the afternoon. Dr. Stone came back alone, and she came later. He says he didn't hear any shot, but admits he's absent-minded. But it all bears out what we think. Only, I said, you haven't caught the murderer. Said the inspector. It was a woman's voice you heard through the telephone. It was in all probability a woman's voice, Mrs. Price Ridley heard. If only that shot hadn't come hard on the close of the telephone call, well, I'd know where to look. Where? Ah, that's just what's best not to say, sir. Unblushingly, I suggested a glass of old port. I have some very fine old vintage port. 11 o'clock in the morning is not the usual time for drinking port. But I did not think that mattered with Inspector Slack. It was, of course, cruel abuse of the vantage point port, but one must not be squeamish about such things. When Inspector Slack had polished off the second glass, he began to unbend and become genial. Such is the effect of that particular port. I don't suppose it matters with you, sir, he said. You'll keep it to yourself. No letting it round the parish? I reassured him. Seeing as the whole thing happened in your house, it almost seems as though you have a right to know. Just what I feel myself, I said. Well then, sir, what about the lady who called on Colonel Prothero the night before the murder? Mrs. Lestrange, I cried, speaking rather loud in my astonishment. The inspector threw me a reproachful glance. "Not so loud, sir. Mrs. Lestrange is the lady I've got my eye on. You remember what I told you, blackmail. Hardly a reason for murder. Wouldn't it be a case of killing the goose that laid the golden eggs? That is, assuming that your hypothesis is true, which I don't for a minute admit." The inspector winked at me in a common manner. "Ah, she's the kind the gentleman will always stand up for. Now look here, sir. Suppose she successfully blackmailed the old gentleman in the past. After a lapse of years, she gets wind of him, comes down here, and tries it on him again. But in the meantime, things have changed. The laws have taken up a very different stand. Every facility is given nowadays to people prosecuting for blackmail. Names are not allowed to be reported in the press. Suppose Colonel Prothero turns around and says he'll have the law on her. She's in a nasty position. They give a very severe sentence for blackmail. The boot's on the other leg. The only thing to do is to save her. The only thing to do to save herself is to put him out good and quick." I was silent. I had to admit that the cause the inspector had built up was plausible. Only one thing to my mind made it inadmissible: the personality of Mrs. Lestrange. "I don't agree with you, Inspector," I said. "Mrs. Lestrange doesn't seem to me to be a potential blackmailer. She's, well, it's the old-fashioned word, but she's a lady." He threw me a pitying glance. "Ah, well, sir," he said tolerantly, "you're a clergyman. You don't know half of what goes on, lady, indeed. You'd be surprised if you knew some of the things I know. I'm not referring to mere social position. Anyway, I should imagine Mrs. Lestrange to be, whatever this word is in French, I guess, déclassée. What I mean is a question of personal refinement. You don't see her with the same eyes as I do, sir. I may be a man, but I'm a police officer, too. They can't get over me with their personal refinement. Why, that woman is the kind who could stick a knife into you without turning a hair. Curiously enough, I could believe Mrs. Lestrange guilty of murder much more easily than I could believe her capable of blackmail. But, of course, she can't have been telephoning to the old lady next door and shooting Colonel Prothero at one and the same time," continued the inspector. The words were hardly out of his mouth when he slapped his leg ferociously. "Got it!" he exclaimed. "That's the point of the telephone call. A kind of alibi. Knew we'd connect it with the first one. I'm going to look into this. She may have bribed some village lad to do the phoning for her. He'd never think of commenting it with the murder." With the murder. The inspector hurried off. "Miss Marple wants to see you. Yay!" said Griselda, putting her head in. She sent over a very incoherent note, all spidery and underlined. I couldn't read most of it. Apparently she can't leave home herself. Hurry up and go across and see her and find out what it is. I've got my old women coming in 2 minutes, or I'd come myself. I do hate old women. They tell you about their bad legs. Rubbing mine right now. And sometimes insist on showing them to you. What luck that the inquest is this afternoon. You won't have to go and watch the boys' club cricket match." I hurried off, considerably exercised. in my mind as to the reason for this summons. I found Miss Marple in what I believe is described as a fluster. She was very pink and slightly incoherent. My nephew, she explained, my nephew Raymond West, the anchor, he's coming today. Such a to-do. I have to see to everything myself. You cannot trust a maid to air a bed properly. And we must, of course, have a meat meal tonight. Gentlemen require such a lot of meat. They do they not? And drink. There certainly should be some drink in the house, and a siphon. If I can do anything, I began. Oh, how very kind. But I did not mean that. There's plenty of time, really. He brings his own pipe and tobacco, I'm glad to say. Glad because it saves me from knowing which kind of cigarettes are right to buy. But rather sorry, too, because it takes so long for the smell to get out of the curtains. Of course, I open the window and shake them well very early every morning. Raymond gets up very late. I think writers often do. He writes very clever books, I believe. Though people are not really nearly so unpleasant as he makes out. Clever young men know so little of life, don't you think? Would you like to bring him to dinner at the vicarage, I asked, still unable to gather why I had been summoned. Oh, no, thank you, said Miss Marple. It's very kind of you, she added. There was something you wanted to see me about, I think, I suggested desperately. Oh, of course. And all the excitement had gone right out of my head. She broke off and called to her aunt. Emily. Emily, not those sheets, the frilled ones with the monogram, and don't put them too near the fire. She closed the door and returned to me on tiptoe. It's just rather a curious thing that happened last night, she explained. I thought you would like to hear about it, though at the moment it doesn't seem to make sense. A lot of this don't make sense to me. I felt very wakeful last night, wondering about all this sad business, and I got up and looked out of my window, and what do you think I saw? I looked inquiring. Gladys Cram, said Miss Marple with great emphasis, as I live going into the wood with a suitcase. A suitcase? Isn't it extraordinary? What should she want to do with a suitcase in the woods at 12 o'clock at night? You see, Miss Marple, I dare say it has nothing to do with the murder. But it is a peculiar thing, and just at present we all feel we must take notice of peculiar things. Totally amazing, I said. Was she going to sleep in the barrow by any chance? She didn't, at any rate, said Miss Marple, because quite a short time afterwards she came back. She hadn't got the suitcase with her. And that's it. So next time we read, which hopefully will be tomorrow, we'll be on 18. And I won't sit here and go to sleep. Oh, mercy. I hope y'all saw that. It was rather entertaining. I freaked out when I woke up. I'm like thinking, how long have I been doing this? I'm still recording. Oh my gosh. Love y'all. Be sweet. Don't be ugly. I'm drinking water, eating pink lady apples. Finished off Hannah and I finished the veggie beef soup today. And we had little quiches for breakfast this morning. I should have talked about that on live. They were so good. Got them in the freezer section of Walmart yesterday. Spinach quiche Florentine, which is spinach quiche, and quiche Lorraine, which is bacon, sometimes ham, and Swiss cheese. So good. I've got 8 more. That might be supper tonight. No, I'll wait till tomorrow and have something else tonight. I may have shepherd's pie. Anyway, night-night. See you around the YouTube streets. Don't forget, Affordably Geeky comes on at 8 bells in the morning. That's Eastern time. And don't forget, I'm on at 3 Saturday and Sunday. And I'm going to be giving away some hooks. Or, so your choice of a set of hooks or some of those kits that I showed with the baby hat or the scarf. Okay. Be sweet, don't be ugly. I'm sure I said that. Love ya. Bye-bye.